Thank you for joining us today for a webinar on detoxification and elimination after home quarantine. Joining us today are Drs. Scott Jamieson.
Greetings.
He's our specialist in internal medicine and functional medicine. Dr. Varsha Rathod. I think, Varsha, we're just going to do a sound check on you.
Hello.
Great, awesome. She's a specialist in internal medicine, functional medicine, and rheumatology. And then Dr. David Tribus, our chiropractor and specialist in homeopathy and energy medicine.
Hello, everyone, and welcome.
Great. It's great having you guys. I am Kadia. I'm going to be the moderator today. My background is in pediatrics, neurology, and headache medicine. So we have a great webinar for you today. And it's wonderful to have a great amount of participants, and I invite you to enter questions on the Zoom feed. We'll get to as many questions as possible, and if not, we'll try to answer them after the webinar. As we move into the 4th month of the COVID pandemic, many individuals are asking us how to detoxify and reset from either recovery of illness or just from their lifestyle habits that they've chosen over the last several months, poor eating and exercising. So as a physician, it always brings me a moment of pause when people say, how do I do detox? Or I am detoxing right now. What does that really mean? And are we all meaning the same thing when we say detox? And are we talking about cleaning up our diet and possibly eliminating excesses and inflammatory foods? Also, another burning question is, why is detoxification important? How does it cause disease? This is an interesting question, and it comes down to a fundamental question in medicine, which is, why do we get ill? This is not an easy answer, and I think it is an interesting one to put into perspective before we dive into detoxification. So disease is rarely a single cause. It's multifactorial. I challenge you to think about disease manifesting from multiple factors. Think about all the experiences you've had in your lifetime. These experiences allow us to be who we are today. Also, they influence how our body mechanics work, our biology, and even how the genetics express themselves. So I'm going to pull up a slide, which is, I think, a really pertinent slide, and we're going to do a test on my ability to multitask. All right. I'm going to rely on Varsha and Scott and David to tell me that they can see my slides. Great. So as it relates to detoxification, over our lifetime, we are exposing ourselves constantly to toxins and things in our environment. And our body works to maintain homeostasis and balance and optimal functioning. This is all happening within the backdrop of our nutrition, our genetics, and our past experiences. There may be a point that enough is enough, and we need to help support. We need to become an active participant in supporting our body to fight and maintain balance in our health. And how do we do this? That's really our question today as it relates to detoxification. So I'd like to turn it over to Scott to really get us going on really how do we look at not just detoxification, but what are toxins and how do they affect our bodies and our health?
Yeah, thank you, Sita. Yeah, I think it's important to understand that concept that we do live in an incredibly toxic and incredibly more toxic world as we go forward. And the best way to think about that there's some descriptors that we use, that toxins are poisons or molecules that are made by living organisms that can hurt us. So a mold toxin, a bacterial toxin, these are the things that we would consider toxins. The jargon for things, molecules that are made outside of living organisms that are poisonous is toxicant. And that, brings into play this incredibly complex world that we live in with heavy metals, with more and more organic pesticides and chemicals that come into play. and really what we consider perhaps to be more environmental toxins. And you can see from this slide that really it's a wide range of things that we all encounter in many ways on a day-to-day basis. And so we live in this world that's toxic, and as our first slide did point out, it's really this balance of what are our exposures, how do we, eliminate what we can, deal with what we can, and really then the balance as we go forward of trying to sort out this toxic burden. And this really brings into play what we consider total toxic burden, because we really can't totally escape in any way these toxins that we encounter daily. And so as we're looking at toxic burden, there's a number of issues that we take into play to understand why, if everybody's being exposed to toxins, why do some people seem to get so sick from these exposures and other people seem to still function well? And we see this sometimes in a family that gets exposed, say, for example, to mold toxins. Out of a family of 4 or 5, same exposure, only one person gets sick or has chronic illness from it. And so we then have to step back, look at things such as this toxic burden. We look at these categories, and I won't go into big detail on these, but really it's genetically, do we have a SNP or a way that our body doesn't handle things correctly? And that can be on all sorts of enzymes and various things that we'll get into a little bit later. But we're learning more and more people have 1 or 2 of these or more of these genetic alterations. We're also learning that some people have many of these. And so if somebody has 1 versus 5, that difference is going to really have an impact on how people genetically handle toxin exposure and toxicant exposure. Diet's so critical in terms of not only the good part of diet, in terms of how you're eating, how well you're maintaining your nutrition, but then unfortunately in the world that we live in, does that diet bring you exposure to further? We all have Roundup in our system, some level of glyphosate that is in our diet, even those of us who try to avoid it. So antibiotics get thrown into the mix, and various things of that regard also then become that next play. Things that happen with our lifestyle, everything from medications that we have to take for some other medical condition, beauty products. Unfortunately, we're learning more and more that the beauty product industry is really one of the most toxic things that we do to ourselves, that many women in particular do, putting makeup and so forth on that contains, for example, levels of cadmium and so forth. And then things that aren't always so easily seen as a toxin in our lifestyle. Obviously, alcohol, excess sugar, tobacco products can play into this mix, but also stress. We know that the more stress we have, it affects so much of our hormone system, and that can affect other things such as our gut biome. And these two kind of play into, again, this toxic burden: sleep, exercise, lack thereof, mental, spiritual, emotional things. If you're going through horrible stress, like so many people have done with the last 4 months, that becomes a checkoff of another source of a stressor that gets put into this toxic burden. Obviously, this last category, environment, what do you live near a golf course or an airport? Are you, do you have a bad water supply? Do you live on a well? That can be a problem. And so as we look at any one patient, and really trying to determine where that balance is. How do we move from, yes, we all have exposures, but how do we get from that to being sick or staying well? It really is looking at this whole concept of total toxic burden and how that plays in, what's defective, what's working well, and trying to come to those decisions that help us work through with a patient who may have a toxin or toxicant related illness. One area that, again, since we're talking about what's happened in the last 4 months, I'll just bring up COVID as another possibility. So it's, again, if we look at this total toxic burden load, we have people who are stressed over work and home life and less activity, eating different, and then they maybe get COVID. That whole total toxic burden makes them perhaps more likely to get COVID, but if you're in that total toxic overload, you may have a worse outcome with that COVID infection as a result of that whole big picture that we just talked about, with all those different levels of how it affects your ability to detox and handle toxic stress.
Thank you, Scott. I think that was a wonderful description of everything that we're talking about when we think about toxins. And I think it's really common where people think that it's just about some of the environmental toxins, and it really is a lot more complicated and a lot more broad than that. And so, David, as we think about toxins, particularly environmental toxins, but some of the other ones that Scott had mentioned, how do they really enter our system? How do they circulate, get stored? And then how does our body kind of eliminate them? Can you go through that process as we think about it?
Sure. So when we think about toxins coming into our system, the first thing I always tell people, you're going to breathe them, right? Even if we look at COVID, we talk about breathing. So we look at bringing things in, breathing through your nose. We also have things we ingest, whether we eat them or we drink them. That allows that to get in our system. You can put stuff on our skin topically. Scott mentioned different chemicals being used in skincare products. And then also injectables. Anything that gets injected into the system can also enter in and cause us a toxic load, depending on how strong your body is to deal with them. You know, one thing that people tell me is, well, why is it a big deal to eat organic, right? Because those chemicals, if I eat them, they go in and they go right out the other side. And really, that's not what happens. You know, just because you ate it and drank it, it's just not going to slide out the other side. It's going to actually be processed in the body. So that brings us to the second part of how does it circulate? You know, the things we eat and drink and even breathe are going to get into our bloodstream, and it's also going to get into our lymphatic system, and it's going to get circulated through the body. And then the liver's there to sort it out. Is it water soluble, fat soluble, and get it ready for excretion. The toxins then can get stored. They can get stored in fat. People have heard that toxins will show up stored in fat, but most people don't know they can also be stored in bone. They can be stored in the connective tissue. They can be stored in your joints, right, with arthritis and things like that. So that's the big ones. And then elimination is kind of the opposite, right? So we're going to breathe out things. We're going to urinate things. We're going to have stools daily, hopefully. That's going to eliminate waste. And then we want to sweat. We want to bring it out. So if it's coming in through the skin, let's bring it back out through the skin. And I think those are the main ways that we're going to eliminate them.
Great, thank you. I think that puts it into perspective. And so as we have this large toxin burden and we are bringing things in, Varsha, what are some of the things that we might think of illnesses and symptoms that manifest with these large toxic burdens or specific toxins that enter in our bodies and get stored and affect our health?
Sure. First, there's not a symptom that is not associated with toxicity. So this makes it really hard. Think about every subject in the field of medicine, like you're a neurologist, there's a cardiologist, I'm a rheumatologist, right? So all of these fields have toxicity. There's not a field where you just have, say, toxicology. Sure, there is, but they're not in the medical division. So really what we are seeing is we have to actually be looking for this in each of our fields, and we're not really trained as physicians to be doing this. So to make you think about the symptoms, I'd like to remind you about that web-like connectivity that we talked about in the last webinar in the digestive system assimilation, that every system, we only have 5 biological systems. So that's our ability to assimilate, whether we breathe it, we digest it, or get it to our skin. And so if there's problems there, for example, a detox product came in, then you could actually have problems in the digestive system, like leaky gut, right? Or you could develop inflammation, autoinflammatory syndromes in the gut. The other system would be your energy system. You could have your immune system. If your energy system fails, what happens? It has to maintain the energy for all other systems. So every system is connected to each other. The detoxification system is really designed to get rid of metabolic and biologic waste. Never in the history of mankind was it that we were subjected to 80,000 plus and rising toxins in every one of us, including newborn babies through the umbilical cord, right? So this system, when it is overburdened, it levies a tax and a toll on all these other four biological systems. And so the digestive system gets leaky, it gets inflamed, the microbiome gets altered. What happens? You get illness, you get symptoms there. You can start bloating, you can get heartburn, you can get constipation, you can get diarrhea, irritable bowel disease, and generally puffy. In the immune system, it drives pro-inflammatory diseases, leading to puffiness and being swollen, tumors, autoimmunity. In the energy system, it leads to uncoupling of energy. And what that simply means is that you're no longer an efficient energy producer, and that leads to fatigue, right? And we don't know how to, in conventional medicine, really study the mitochondria for fatigue. But without fuel, your car doesn't run. Without fuel, your systems won't run. The hormonal system takes a huge beating because, like Scott said, every toxin, which is an organic toxin, is actually can sit on the estrogen receptor. So if it sits on the estrogen receptor, it actually estrogenizes our body, both males and females. And that means it leads to this abdominal obesity that happens. So you can begin to see how every one of these is how it's connected to obesity. Now you can recognize this pattern in COVID. Who are the ones who are getting the morbid and high mortality with COVID infection? It is the ones who are obese, the ones who have hypertension, the ones who have diabetes. These are all linked to insulin resistance. And also those who come from lower socioeconomic conditions. And think of where toxins are dumped in most cities. It's always where the lower socioeconomic people live. Sure, vitamin D is important, but there's also economic resources that are not available, right? So when you think of symptoms, any symptom can be linked to it, any symptom. We just have to learn to how to link and think about that web-like connectivity between all the systems.
Thanks, Varsha. Yeah, I think that as complex as disease presence, it's also just how many different organ systems and how does it all manifest. And so this is where I think also looking at things from an energetic standpoint is helpful. So when we're looking at what are all the symptoms, we can also see if there's any difficulties that are happening in our energetic system. And I think, David, if you could kind of help us understand, what are we talking about when we're talking about our energetic system and as it relates to disease?
Right. That's as you know, the big part of what I do. So the energy system, I want people to think of it as your power supply, right? So your body has a certain amount of power that it's going to use on a daily basis, and each organ system is going to get allotted a certain number or a certain amount of energy. And if it has to detoxify, or if it's circulating blood, or if it's filtering lymph, there's got to be enough energy for that organ system to function normally. And so what I look for is what systems are actually not in optimal range, so that they can't, they're not doing their function, they're not functioning normally, so that we can bring them back up to speed. So in the person's healing process, they can get there a lot faster.
Yeah, and I know that this has been particularly helpful for us as we've combined the different approaches and taking care of individuals at Palm. So we've talked a lot about what are the toxins, how are they circulated, how do they get into our system circulated and stored, what are some of those symptoms? And so I think it's now pertinent to really talk about, well, what should our bodies be doing to detoxify? And so, Scott, I was hoping if you could really run through, what does detoxification mean from kind of a generic or as simple as possible as we can get?
Yes. So what we're really talking about in detoxification in that sense is really biotransformation. We're taking a molecule and figuring out a way to change it from a more active, more dangerous to the body form in a way that's less dangerous and prepares it really for being removed from the body. So as you can see on this slide, when we talk about this, we're really talking about, where is it coming from? How's it getting into the body, as Dr. Tribus alluded to? But then once it's in our body, what can we do? How can we deal with it in a way that helps us really get rid of it and really dampen down its effect into the body and the function of the body. And then once it's in that mode, how do we then go to that next step of elimination? How do we get it out? How do we, through the urine, through the stool, exhale, sweat it out? These are kind of the things that the body's, in an optimal way working to achieve an appropriate detoxification. This slide's a little busy and not meant to be problematic, but it's important to understand, and it's something that we talk about in clinic all the time as we're dealing with things, because as Varsha alluded to, these processes interact and become an important player in just about every sort of disease state or symptom state we see, but also in terms of developing a good preventive health program, how to optimize a person's detoxification, because we're all going to get exposed to this wide range of toxins. So even in a proactive, preventive way, helping rev up, if you will, or optimize this ability to detox, biotransform things, puts you in a better position going forward. So the basic concept is that we really have two steps to this biotransformation. If you could go back once, yeah, thank you. So there's the first one, which is phase one, and these mostly happen in the liver. It can occur in the kidney and a few other places, but mainly this is a liver-driven process. The fat-soluble toxin or toxicant is taken, runs through the liver, and there's a variety of important chemical processes and enzymatic steps. Something you may hear us occasionally refer to as the cytochrome P450 system, and it goes through these variety of chemical steps. It takes a basically fat-soluble toxin or toxicant and moves it to an intermediate step on our way to making it more water-soluble so that it can be eliminated. And we'll go into some more detail why there's some importance there, but you can see at the bottom, there's some nutrients that are important to expedite this. And then as we go to phase two, where we're taking that now intermediate metabolite, moving it through this phase two, which is basically hooking it up to a carrier molecule, which then makes it water soluble so that it can go out in the urine, the bile, the stool. This slide's a good referral, but in that it shows some of the nutrients that are very helpful for phase two. One important concept, and we'll touch on this later, is that if you have an imbalance between phase one, phase two, moving a toxin through phase one, but then unable to move it out of phase two, that in-between step can actually be more dangerous or more toxic than it was even in the early phase. So it's important to have this balance. It's important to really focus on particularly optimizing phase two and then the elimination phase. One of the reasons that we talk about well hydrated and staying good daily bowel movements, not constipated, if there's a block in either of those next steps, then we have toxins that are in this, ready to be eliminated phase, not being eliminated, and can actually be reabsorbed and cause more issues. Now the next slide, please. And then so really gets us down to, again, back to this concept of total toxic load. And again, it's everything we've been talking about, this, what is your exposure? What, a little here and a little there goes a long ways as we put it together into that total toxic exposure. Then from that, in hopefully a positive way, we're looking at the body's ability to biotransform and the body's ability to excrete toxins. So if you look at this as a formula, we have X amount of negative exposure minus our hopefully positive ability to detox, biotransform things, excrete things. If we have a person who's very high on the toxic exposure, then even pretty healthy biotransformation and ability to excrete can be overwhelmed. And likewise, we can have someone with a sort of minimal or less toxic exposure, but if they have difficulty with certain biotransformation steps through genetics or nutrient deficiencies or other toxins, or the inability to excrete, we can see how that equation quickly can, even from a low level of exposure, become a toxic or negative total toxic load. So this is a good concept to move forward as we're trying to figure out how to optimize everyone's exposure and everybody's response to that exposure.
Thanks, Scott. I think that it would be good to now turn to really how do we put this in the frame of reference when we see patients And so for our show is hoping that we can really use a case that how do we look at a case and a patient example where toxic burden and detoxification became very relevant to their illness or to their symptoms and progression through their health.
Yeah, I have a great one because this particular patient has been followed over 20 years, so it becomes really valuable to look at it. So this is a story of a female who at age 29 gets her first known toxic burden, two amalgams. Then at 34, she was exposed while she was pregnant to a food source of mercury, a kind of a storage chemical which had mercury in it. And at 35, after 5 months after delivery, she develops full-blown Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. At that time, her diet had been the standard American diet, we call it SAD, with a few more vegetables. Her stress was high. She was put on Synthroid after the diagnosis, and she gains 10 pounds. So then she talked to her physician, went on Armour Thyroid, and this kind of stabilized. It didn't make her lose weight. It stabilized her weight, hair fell out, continues to have symptoms, chronic sinus problems, hives and urticaria with any food that she ate. It was particularly bad with eggs. So she went on numerous elimination diets, but couldn't really stick to any particular diet. You know, it's like, it was too much for her with her stress. So she finally decides, okay, she'll stay on a 75% gluten-free and egg-free diet because she really craved these, and began to realize that repeated testing showed that eggs were positive, and sure enough, she would get hives and urticaria and migraines with them. Then she noticed that if she took some zinc and selenium, that her thyroid numbers by labs would stabilize. So then she found out that she was iodine. So as her physician was learning, she found out that she was iodine deficient, and so started to replace those. But the real learning came when she did a test known as estrogenomic, a genetic test where she found out that she had 3 genetic polymorphisms, or we call weak links, where she could not detoxify efficiently, especially what she ingested mercury, right? So once you recognize this, then it became, oh, I understand why I need to eat dark green leafy vegetables, which you never liked before. I understand why I need to eat these colorful broccoli compounds, because that's what was needed for her thyroid. So, so then as she started to do this and started to get better with her diet, she was able to help her adrenal system, stabilize her thyroid. Then it came to the stage of detoxification of mercury. So she, remember what she had to do. She had to first heal her gut. And it took several years, because it's not easy for people to change their diet. It really is not. And so until you're made to understand why and you recognize it, then you're ready to make that change. And then finally, she underwent chelation therapy when she was able to give herself enough of the necessary precursors that the 3 genes, that she was supporting those 3 genes that I was talking about. And in about, so this was by about 2010, she was free of all thyroid medication. In other words, her Hashimoto's was gone, her antibodies were gone. So it was quite a story, right? So her last thing before she got rid of Hashimoto's was she was perimenopausal, not yet menopausal, but she started to cycle her hormones. And that then put her into a rhythm, which really got that Hashimoto's under control. So after 14 years, she's no longer on any thyroid hormone, and everybody around her saying, no, you can never get off thyroid hormones. But wait a minute, the story's not over. She continues 5 years without thyroid hormones, and then she starts personal training and loses about 10 pounds of weight. She was on a vacation, and when she was on vacation, she realizes, oh my God, she's napping through the day in places that she loves to be, and foods that she loves to eat. And so goes and gets over-the-counter thyroid medicine, which you can in Asian countries, and all her fatigue goes away. So she knows she's hypothyroid again. And as she starts thinking and talking to her physician about it, she realizes that she was not supporting her detoxification system consistently. And so as she lost weight, toxins were mobilized, and it actually caused her to become hypothyroid. Luckily, once she recognized that, in 2 months, she was able to get off thyroid and is still thyroid free. So it's a very dynamic story. It's in real time. You know, every time you lose weight, you can't lose sight of the fact that you're mobilizing toxins and you need to support that system. So I hope this is illuminative to you about how there's a genetic component, then there's the lifestyle component, then there are the labs that we use, from food allergy testing to genetic SNPs to checking for energy system, checking the immune system because of our constant hives, etc. To finally get her well, and to check for multiple mineral deficiencies, which zinc was her worst. Right, so all of us have so many of these stories. We have, I mean, every day we can give you stories of patients who have detoxed. I think of a guy who came in with rage and dizziness and tinnitus, so acute, so acute. When he goes to urgent care, they're like, you know, everybody gets tinnitus. No, he was rage fogging of his attic. And he was sensitive, and he had low body glutathione levels. And so once I replaced glutathione, literally more than 50% of his symptoms go away within 2 weeks.
And I think that's, you know, that really just begs to say that there's no case that's ever easy, and they all have this complex nature of them. And I think that, Scott, when we were kind of thinking about evaluating patients, Varsha has mentioned a lot of these components that we look at when we're evaluating. And it's not just that we're narrowing in just on detoxification, but we're looking at a whole system. So when you have somebody who has all these exposures and is not responding to medications for, let's say, the thyroid disease, like in Varsha's case, how do you kind of start putting this together and putting this puzzle? And where do you really start from when you're putting that functional medicine hat on and sitting down and saying, where should we start from evaluation? And what are those things that we should be considering in that entire toolbox for evaluating a patient as complex as these that we're seeing at home?
Well, I think it's always in functional medicine. It always starts with a good history and being aware. I think these are both great cases that Varsha's brought up, but they also show how easily it could go the other way. It could easily be ignored and not taking that little bit dive deeper into root cause and these very complex multi-level systems that we're dealing with. And the first case could have easily just been left on thyroid for the rest of that person's life. So I think a history and awareness and being prepared to think outside that box of isolated symptoms. What I think is both of these cases, but particularly the first case illustrate, it really is, it's not a fast process. It's a complicated, multi-step, and sometimes it is that looking at food allergies. It's often, and very often for us in functional medicine, starts with healing the gut and the gut microbiome. But it's a looking at the whole person, really looking at every functional system that Dr. Rato brought up, but then coming back to special testing. You know, is there food testing? We have the ability to test for environmental toxins in people's urine and people's blood and heavy metals and these various ways that we can actually look, if we're suspecting it, really start to dive in and find identifiable levels of, you know, benzenes and different things in people's blood and urine that help us tie things together. We can do genetic testing to look for who has these SNPs or these genetic alterations in the way critical enzymes work. It's aware of being what other supplements people are on and meds they're on, because they can affect particularly the cytochrome P450 system against stress. So it really becomes the poster case of looking at the functional medicine matrix, how all of these systems interplay. And again, in the correct patient, unfortunately, it often takes that positive interplay of pulling these systems back into alignment to get a healthy outcome that we're after. In the first case, you know, the trigger, the thing we always are talking about are triggers. You know, it appears to be the amalgams, but it was in a person who had some of these underlying, the diet was not perfect, that had some of the underlying genetic SNPs. So it's really the kind of partnership between a medical care provider and that patient to keep looking, keep searching, try to put all these pieces in. And it's often a very complex puzzle, but often the outcomes and benefits when we work our way through that, make that diagnosis, often many years worth of symptoms and non-healthy status suddenly makes sense and offers a point of leverage to move people forward to a more optimal point of wellness.
Thanks, Scott. I think it's a nice framework of, you describing that framework from a functional medicine standpoint. I'd like to turn it over to David. And David, if you can kind of describe to us from an energetic standpoint, what are you looking at from an evaluation?
Great. So as we mentioned before, I'm looking at the power supply coming into the body. So what I like to do is I start off every visit, at least with a new client, is with an accugraph. And the accugraph shows me how the power is running through the body. So we'll see here, all these bars are green, but they're all representative of a specific organ. This particular patient was feeling great. There wasn't any issues going on, except you see one set of bars down on the right side that are red, and that means that system's working too hard. And after questioning a little bit longer, we found out that that person was actually having a lot of worry. And in Chinese medicine, worry relates to the stomach. And so as Scott mentioned earlier, emotions can play in this also. And then when we look at another graph here, this particular graph you can see is much more out of balance. And so we want to get the systems back into balance so that I can support the medical team, but more importantly, people can help to get their body stronger faster. So if we take a quick look at this, we see the small intestine is low in energy, it's blue. The large intestine is low in energy in blue. So imagine if you turn down the dimmer switch on a light. It just doesn't have enough power to do its job efficiently. So we want to bring the energy up to those because that's going to help digestion and elimination. And when we go over and look at the next two, the liver and the kidney, they're both red. So that tells me right off the bat, their elimination system is already struggling. So we want to do things to help support the liver, support the kidney with elimination and help bring that power down. That way, when we start getting into more of a program to where they're detoxing or whatever, that their system is able to do it more effectively.
Thanks, David. I think that really just shows that complementary nature of how these things tie together. And I think Varsha, if you can kind of really help us understand as we look at these components from a functional medicine standpoint, from an energetic standpoint, how do we now start to think about it from a treatment standpoint, and how do we orient ourselves in that?
Yeah, so the order of treating and prioritization is really important when dealing with toxins. We almost always start with the gut first, because if you don't have a good digestive system, you cannot eliminate toxins. And you also need to get your microbiome and your immune system healthy to get that puffiness down. So that's where we usually start. Sita, if you'll put up the picture. So here, ideally, in an ideal world, you want to limit the exposures, right? So, but the patient doesn't come to you with already having limited exposures if they already have a problem. So then the thing to do is to start to support biotransformation. When we help the digestive system, what we are doing is actually beginning to help the biotransformation system through food, through vitamins, through minerals, and supplementation based on their genetics, etc. So we get that data early on, like Scott was alluding to. You know, we might check some SNPs, we might check some food sensitivities, we might check for the adrenal and thyroid system to see that they're functioning, the energy system is working well. And that's why I love working with David, because sometimes I will do these tests and patients will say, see, I told you I don't have any symptoms in the gut, but yet the test shows there's a gut problem, so the test must be wrong, correct? And then the accugraph also shows me that they have either very low energy in that system or very high energy in opposing systems. So to me, it's like, look, you may not understand it, you may not have those symptoms, but this is what we need to do. And it also helps with prioritization there. So yeah, we never ever start with detoxification. I'm sure, Scott, you can allude to this. It's the rare patient that comes in who's so darn healthy that you can say, okay, right off the bat, I'm going to do a urine toxic metals and start to chelate you. No, I would be afraid. I'd say, just give me a month or two till I get to know you, you know, and be sure that I'm really convinced that you have what you need to maintain your digestive health, that you will take some core supplements. Not everybody can afford to check these detoxification SNPs, but if you can't, we can at least make sure that your diet has full of the ingredients that are necessary so that you can both support your MTHFR gene or glutathione gene at the very least, and just get a wide variety of colors. So think about this patient that I presented. She failed her diet several times, so she could not proceed to the next step. And I need you to understand it. I mean, it didn't take years for her to get better because it needs to take years. She couldn't make the change. And we see that a lot in our practices, that sometimes we need behavior modification till you're ready to accept the change and see that you need the change. And often we will do these tests, not just to convince ourselves, but also to convince you that you need to make that change. And then finally, when she was able to change and then and began to accept food as medicine, then came supplements, detoxification, then hormonal balancing, which was kind of tricky because she was in the perimenopausal period, and then finally got well. So I hope that gives you, I mean, I can't really talk about exactly how you would treat detoxification, but it gives you an overview. What you should know, however, is that we don't really test for most toxins. The ideal toxin that we check for are those that are easily testable, and that's mercury, lead, heavy metals. We can, like Scott said, check for benzenes or check for PCBs, but it's so expensive. Each test is so expensive, and it's just a random urine collection that sometimes you may not release these products, so you might get a false negative test, and it's not worth spending $400 for it.
Thanks, Varsha. I think that kind of brings me back to what I was saying at the very beginning of the webinar is, what do we mean when we talk about detoxification? And I think that so many times we don't start there. That's not where we start with the gut. We start with nutrition and how do we balance things in other ways before we get into that detoxification. And then detoxification has so many different layers, and it really requires a very systematic approach. So I think that, David, this is one of the questions that I always have is, what is really truly the difference between when we talk about the elimination diet versus a cleanse versus a detox or a detox diet?
Right. That question gets asked a lot. And as Varsha and Scott both said, we want to start in the gut. So the elimination diet is basically that. You're going to eliminate specific groups of foods to give your digestive system a break and allow it to decrease the inflammation, calm itself down, and then you'll do this for about 4 to 6 weeks, and then you can actually start to reintroduce some of these foods depending on if you have a sensitivity to them or not. A lot of times we'll eliminate, eggs and we bring them back in and we don't have a problem anymore. Sometimes we're like myself, I'm allergic to eggs, so I can't bring them back in. So the elimination diet helps us to find problems. I ate eggs so much, I ate eggs every day, and I didn't even notice a difference until I stopped them. So the elimination diet really brings a lot of awareness to things you're not really paying attention to. When we look at detox, the detox is more specifically, we're looking at the phase 1 and phase 2 liver detoxification that Scott was talking about. Here, we're going to actually support the liver with specific nutrients to help that phase 1, the phase 2, like we saw on that slide, and get those toxins ready for elimination. A cleanse, on the other hand, I always think of a cleanse more as you're forcing the body to focus on a specific organ than actually, like, we're going to do a liver cleanse, or we're going to do a kidney cleanse, or there's all kinds of cleanses out there, and a lot of times they're beneficial, but usually not till the end. So we're going to focus specific nutrients to help force an organ system to cleanse itself, and usually there's a bowel component to that. We want to excrete the toxins from there through the bowels.
Thanks so much. I think that's a great synopsis, and it's something that I have to commonly discuss with individuals is, what are they meaning when they're saying detox or cleanse? So I think that's a great way of putting it. And so I'm going to kind of turn a little bit back to just this the concept of toxic load. And what are we, we're going to always be exposed to a lot of toxins. So Varsha, when we talk about toxic load and we know we're going to have these exposures, what's the right amount? How do we know what is appropriate and what is allowable?
Well, that's a trick question, right? It's like an exam question. Supposed to say no toxin, but that's not feasible in this world, right? Scott already pointed out we have lots. So, all right, the answer is there is no right answer, right? So you want to minimize it always. So there's no right amount of toxic load. It really is that some equation that we were talking about. So it's looking like you have to know what your SNPs are. And then what you can biotransform well, and then what you can excrete. So for each one, the toxic load is quite different. Again, I'm going to point you out to the patient that I discussed. She was a canary in the mercury mine, if you will, because she had three SNPs actually, a double MTHFR SNP and a glutathione SNP, where she could not excrete mercury. You, Sita, might have been able to excrete that mercury, but she could not. Okay, so she became the canary in the mine, and someone else as well may not have had a problem. So there's no real way of saying, okay, there's the right amount of toxin or the lowest amount of toxin. You want to do the best to always try to minimize it. And then if you have to deal with it, then you deal with it by day-to-day living, by hydration, by using dry brushing, by using sauna. You know, you can do these things to try and get rid of toxins early on if you keep it minimum to start with. I hope that answered your question. There was not a direct answer to that question.
It was meant to be a trick question. It's always those hard questions that we have. So we can't have a detox conversation without talking about xenoestrogens and how the estrogen system works and plastics and so forth. So I'd really love for Scott, if you can really tell us what we're talking about when we're talking about the estrogen system and how it relates to detoxification and some of the toxins that we're exposed to.
Yeah, we're finding that a huge variety of these toxins are actually endocrine disruptors. So they can affect the thyroid system, adrenal system. We're seeing huge connections with obesity and diabetes rates. There's data that just being obese does not make you have diabetes. It's obesity plus toxic load. So these are very important groups. And then of that subgroup is really a group that are these really xenoestrogens. And it's important to note that the problem is that many of these organic compounds share a very similar organic structure with the estrogen molecule. And so that allows them to basically fit into the structure of the estrogen receptor and act just like an estrogen. And so we see problems in young, even as Varsha pointed out, even in cord blood, we see these toxins floating around in cord blood of newborn infants. We see men who are having troubles with infertility, women with a variety of everything from fibroids to PCOS. So as these chemicals, and we make more every year, have that ability to fit in, lock in to the estrogen receptor. And sometimes they lock in a way, unlike true estrogen, it's stuck. It turns on that key into the keyhole in a way that receptor stays activated without a way for the body to turn it off. So it becomes this estrogen dominant, this ongoing estrogen stimulation that we think is important in so many things in cancer, obesity, diabetes, and really quite problematic. And this brings in all these 80,000 plus compounds, and the huge majority of them are estrogen-like or estrogen toxic, and plastics and more nanoplastics, PBA, all of these things and probably many that we don't even have identified. There's so many metabolites that we don't even understand. So it really, this whole xenoestrogen compound problem is just profound, and its impact, particularly if you look at obesity and diabetes, just really critical findings for our society.
Thanks. I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate is just how these toxins are similar to things that are inherent in our body and then activate our estrogen system. So how they kind of almost mimic estrogen and then they activate it, and that's why we're seeing these. And it's just a fascinating thing that happens. And I think something that we should all be very health conscious about. So I think that to wrap it up, I want to kind of post that question of we've all been in under home quarantine. And let's say that we've been working at home for the last 3 months and you've gained, 5 to 10 pounds, and you've been in front of the computer for 8 hours a day, working from home. You've been streaming lots of videos because you can't go out to eat. You know, and the question is coming to us. We're getting it all the time these last few weeks is, should I be detoxing? Should I cleanse? Should I eliminate? So Varsha, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, start with the computer. You know, I mean, I have to work. I mean, I have to work from 9 to about 6 o'clock every day on the computer, or maybe longer. But no matter what happens, for myself, I've decided by 8 o'clock, lights out. Okay, there's no blue light coming in. So that's one simple thing that you could do. Just simply cut off all blue light, which means your telephone, your computer, your iPads, television, cut it out. TiVo it if you want and watch it at a later time. That's one thing. And then get up in the morning and be out in the sun. This is a great time to reset your brain clock. So about 7 o'clock, if you reset your, see the sun or be in sunlight, you reset your brain clock and it sets 14 hours to sleep. And then start a simple cleanup of the major symptoms, your diet. Watch it, check it. You know, don't come to us to say, hey, you know, I think you need to put me on an elimination diet. You can do this yourself, right? I mean, I just today came off a 4-day, 5-day gut cleansing diet, and it just feels invigorating. Sita, I know you're on one as well and coming off of it. So it just feels so awesome to help you regenerate. I need to get off my butt and exercise. So luckily my daughter's at home. We're starting today. So, you know, starting to just say, I'm going to take action and just do it. You know, you just have to do it. Allow time for yourself and then give yourself time for meditation. Start your day and end your day with meditation. I think it is so valuable.
Thanks, Varsha. Scott and David, do you have anything else to add?
I think the only thing I would add, again, I agree with everything, and unfortunately that applies to all of us, but the one thing that I forget when I'm sitting and working from the computer all day is to drink enough water. And so I think that's a very, again, if we're talking about that elimination part, is for all systems is staying well hydrated. So I think that's one thing that a lot of us working from home forget, is to stay hydrated with good, clean water.
I think I'll add here, since I'm the energy guy, we are energy generators. Our bodies create energy, and they create energy through movement. So everybody got stuck behind a computer and we're spending time studying, but we've got all this input. We need some more movement. We need to just get up, move around, wave your arms around, do some bending, some flexing, just move. No, sitting is the new smoking. It's time to get up and start moving and start to generate more energy.
I love that analogy. Sitting is the new smoking. I think that's very fitting. So we have one question that came through, and I think it would be great to answer this, and this is for Varsha. So the question is what should I eat during that 5-day gut cleanse that you just mentioned?
Oh, you need to come and see me. That's a little complicated. It was tough because I was hungry all 5 days. Basically, a few root vegetables. All cruciferous vegetables are taken out, even though it is very healthy for you, and it's because it's a big bloat factor. Asparagus, celery, green beans, all this winter and summer squashes. Rice is the only grain you can eat. Hopefully brown rice or brown rice crackers, and that's about it. Salt is the only condiment. No peppers, no spices. So everything has to be steamed. You can eat pitted fruit. So that's peaches, prunes, plums, cherries, but it has to be cooked. And for the first time in my life, this is the second time I'm doing it, I realized how incredible cherries and peaches are poached. If you've not tried it, try it. It will take the place, nearly take the place of ice cream.
Thanks, Varsha. So I appreciate all of your time and effort to all of you, David, Scott, and Varsha. We really appreciate all the efforts that you have in putting these webinars together and to help inform our members. I think it will go a long way over time, and I really look forward to them every time. So I hope you guys are learning, and I'm learning, and all the participants are learning. So as we continue our journey to look at the different topics that we set forth when we first started these webinars, we had turned to really looking at the kind of fundamentals of functional medicine, from the digestive system, immune system, detoxification, hormonal, and energy. So now that we've really tackled what is detoxification, we want to give a flavor of the hormonal system. And want to focus on adrenal fatigue next time. It's just like detoxification is a common question. We're getting the question is, what is adrenal fatigue and how does it relate to us and our disease? So we'd like to invite you guys to participate with that as well. That will be in July, I believe July 16th. So mark your calendars. Thank you so much for participating, and we'll see you guys shortly. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.